Hello and good evening. Today is February the 23rd. It is Tuesday, and this proves that teachers have homework too, that we do at night. Yeah. And so, yes, so the subject matter of today, once again, is imperialism in Africa, particularly in the latter part of the 19th century, but imperialism in Africa overall. Just a little spoiler alert, I will have this picture for you to show you tomorrow. You see, this shows Africa in 1880. In 1880, Africa, 1/10 of African land, was owned by European countries. In 1914, 9/10 of Africa was owned by European countries. And the only two places that weren't owned by European countries was Ethiopia and Sierra Leone. Ethiopia was an independent country that, by pluck and luck and all sorts of other things, stayed independent. Liberia, forgive me, Liberia. Sierra Leone was a British colony. That's it in the pink right there. In fact, everything here in the pink is British. But Liberia was an American protectorate, a country that the United States built to be a home for slaves that the American Colonization Society had purchased because they wanted to get rid of slavery in the United States. So let's talk about imperialism in Africa, shall we? All right. Three groups fought for control of South Africa, and this is South Africa. The Dutch, meaning the Netherlands, the British, and of course the Africans themselves. These conflicts between these three groups carried on for the better part of 100 years. The fiercest fighting tribes in all of Africa were the Zulus, Zulu warriors. Shaka Zulu, um, for lack of a better comparison, Shaka Zulu could be compared to the Native American personality Tecumseh. Tecumseh, if you recall from your American history, actually tried and came close to uniting the Native American tribes in North America against the American government. Shaka Zulu tried to do the same. The Zulus fought fiercely against British rule, and even though the Zulus were armed only with spears and knives, the Zulus, handed the British army one of its most severe defeats in history before the British finally subdued them. In 1887, of course, the British by that time were thoroughly supplied with Maxim automatic guns and artillery. The Africans had neither artillery nor cavalry nor automatic weapons. The Dutch had taken South Africa away from the Portuguese in 1652 so that they would have a way station. You know, you see ships coming from Europe down around here would need a place to stop because the oceans down in this area of the world are notorious for great white sharks, bull sharks, but also for bad weather. And so this made a great stopping off point. And so, yeah, as their ships headed toward Indonesia and the Spice Islands. Settlers in this part of Africa, European settlers, Dutch European settlers, were called Boers, which is a Dutch word that meant farmers, because that's what most of them did. But they were also called, let's write it here, please. They were also called Afrikaners. Yes. Today, the primary language in South Africa is still Afrikaans, which is a combination of Dutch, English, and the years of evolution between the two. Ah, yes, this word here, kiffa. Mr. Mr. Horton taught you a dirty word. Yeah. Kiffa is a generic term, racial slur. It is the equivalent to the N word in the United States. It's what Europeans called Africans. And since the Europeans had bigger guns, they got away with it. So in the 1830s, these Dutch farmers began what was called the Great Trek. They moved northward to claim the new lands north from the southern coast and also to get away from British rule. They too found themselves fighting the Zulus. However, when gold and diamonds were discovered in South Africa in the 1860s and 1880s, a gold rush ensued, and the Dutch farmers fought to keep these fortune seekers away from their land. And what eventually resulted is something called the Boer War. The Boer War was it's a little spoken about war that took place between, of course, the British and these Boers in South Africa who wanted to be out from under British rule. And you would think that, the British would be able to overwhelm these Dutch farmers, but the Dutch farmers put up quite a resistance against the British. This war took years, and also this war is often called the First Total War. The Boers, for example, launched commando guerrilla raids on the British. The British, in turn, burned Boer farms and placed Boer women and children in, and you heard it here first, the first concentration camps. Do not go around thinking that the Nazis were the first people to come up with this idea of concentration camps. No, it was our friends, the British. And they took these Boer women and children and placed them in these camps where the conditions were very harsh. Sanitation was terrible. Disease was rampant. Food was not plentiful enough. And as it says there, 14,000 Afrikaans. Afrikaans. I misspelled that. Let's write it again, shall we? Afrikaners. That's the proper name. Dutch Afrikaners died in these concentration camps. 14,000. Yeah, I know it pales in comparison to the 16 million, 16, not 6, 16 million victims of the Nazi concentration camps, but these were the prototypes. The British finally won the war. Uh, the Boer Republic then joined the rest of the Union of South Africa as an independent republic under British control, part of the British Commonwealth. In other words, they were an independent republic, but they were going to do what the British told them to. Europeans dominated and controlled Africa with one thought in mind, and that was to control Africa's land, its people, but especially African resources. The new imperialism of the 19th century desired to control the economic, political, pardon me, and social lives of the people. They wanted to make Africans like Europeans, only subordinate. So, what does that mean? It meant that they wanted Africans to be able to speak English, to be able to understand European customs and ways. But by the fact of the matter that they were African, they would always be second and third class citizens. I mean, to this, into the 1990s, there was a system called apartheid in South Africa, a system of forced legalized segregation in Africa. Four forms of European control emerged from the African colonies. The colony was the old type. The European country came in and basically set up shop. They ran the country totally. The country was managed by European officers, European administrators, and no question about it. The second kind was the protectorate, where the European country would claim that to protect the country, it would establish a large military presence in the country. And the primary purpose of the military presence was to make sure that the natives didn't cause any trouble. The other kind, sphere of influence. Now, in a sphere of influence, and you see this more in China, but in a sphere of influence, the European power um, was the primary trading partner and did not allow anyone else, any other European countries, to come in and compete for buying the natural resources, for selling marketable products to the native peoples. Yeah, it's a sphere of influence. And finally, economic imperialism, where the country, and you find this in India, where the country was ran not by the government and not even by a European government. The country was ran by a company. In the case of India, the British East India Company ran the nation of India, one of the most heavily populated countries in the world. For much of its history, was organized and ran, and by ran I mean they had armies, soldiers, and courts by a company. Yeah, a company. Now, the British and the United States, please don't get the wrong idea. Oh, the United States, we're nice guys. We don't do that kind of stuff. Actually, we did. The British and the US preferred indirect control of these lands. France and most other colonial powers preferred a more direct control, such as France and French Indochina. Later, the management method will go a long way in determining the type of government those newly freed countries will develop. Indirect control relied on local rulers. The British and later Americans would choose a governor from amongst the local populace who would teach the local councils how to rule. The idea was that these rulers would teach the locals how to rule themselves along British or American models. What's wrong with this idea? It's because maybe the locals wouldn't want it. Nobody ever asked the locals what they wanted. Britain did this in Canada and Australia and the United States. And the United States attempted it in the Philippines. However, there's one thing worth mentioning about the way the British did it in Canada and Australia, and how the United States failed to do it in the Philippines. In order for this to really work, where the European country comes in and sets up a shop, pardon me, in both the United States, I'm sorry, in both Canada and Australia, the British wiped out the local native populations. Yeah, that's kind of one of the dirty secrets, even of a nice country like Canada. People think of Canada as like kind of being everybody's friend. Nothing bad ever happened there. Well, actually, it did. Lots and lots of Native Americans died under European rule, British rule primarily. Same. Oh, in Australia, it was much worse because in Australia, the Aborigines had made the mistake of being really not white, and the British government for a time, and later the Australian government for a time, put a bounty on the heads of the Aborigines, the native indigenous peoples of Australia. And after somebody convinced the British that maybe you shouldn't try to kill these people, they tried to do what the United States did, and that was to make the Aborigines British, teach them English, to teach them British customs, teach them how to take to learn trades. Of course, the problem was the trades that the British taught, and later the Australian government taught the Aborigines, were trades like how to be a household servant. Yeah, how to farm, how to do menial tasks, cleaning, those domestic work, those kind of things. So that was the kind of education they got. Direct control involved paternalism. Paternalism, the key word in paternalism there is father, meaning that one group, one party, tells the other group what to do, like a father tells his children what to do. In which the Europeans brought in administrators and would not allow local peoples to rule themselves. The French also used a policy called assimilation, thinking that the local peoples would become assimilated to French culture and eventually abandon their own. I mean, for example, the French tried to implant Roman Catholicism. I'm going to sneeze again, if you'll pardon me. Roman Catholicism. Tried to implant Roman Catholicism in Indochina, which has one of the largest Buddhist populations in the world. And there is a chain of thought that says, well, they're just teaching them Christianity. They're just trying to save their souls. That's a nice idea, but at the same time, it is very imperialistic. So, especially when you force it down somebody's throat. This did not work and later was abandoned in favor of a policy called association, where they recognized African institutions, but they saw them as being inferior to French ones. So, the British takeover and control of the West African nation of Nigeria is a classic example of colonialism, imperialism that was taking place in Africa and around the globe in the latter part of the 19th century. Britain gained control of southern Nigeria, and I don't, unfortunately, you have the map. Look on page 781, through both diplomatic, which means negotiating, and military, which means shooting first and asking questions later, means. The British control of the northern half of Nigeria was accomplished largely through the work of the Royal Niger Company, which was the African counterpart to the British East India Company. I mean, much of Britain's colonial empire was ran by companies, stock owning companies. Note here that capitalist Western countries often use companies to colonize areas, and that the British government would subsidize these companies, oftentimes with British soldiers. What commodity attracted Britain to this area? Answer: palm oil. Palmoil. What is palm oil? You never heard of it? You never tasted it? Actually, you probably have. Palm oil is a substance, made from the oil of the palm tree. How do you extract it? I don't know. But I do know that if you look at the ingredients of your candy bars, of some of your decadently sweet chocolates, and things that are really not good for you but taste really good, probably there's palm oil. Yeah, in it. And so it was very valuable to the British. In 1914, Britain claimed all of Nigeria as a colony. Now, managing a culturally diverse area like Nigeria proved to be difficult for the British. Why? Because, you see, Nigeria was made up of, as it says here, three African subgroups. The Hausa Fulani, who, by the way, were Christian, the Yoruba, who were Muslim. By the way, I mean, sure you've heard the Beach Boys sing about these guys. Aruba, Jamaica, yeah, that's Yoruba. And Igbo, who were more of they had more of a religion that was more of the old tribal mystic type pharaoh religions of the African bush. The British did not have enough available troops to control Nigeria, so they had to depend on indirect control, which means they enlisted the locals, paid them off. The Africans resented British rule, and ironically, look at this. Notice I wrote this in all caps. The British rule of Nigeria actually united these three major tribes, the Hausa Fulani, the Yoruba, and the Igbo, to throw British rule out of Nigeria and establish a united colony. Problem is, that's not going to happen until after World War II. A lot of things going to happen after World War II. Naturally, the Africans resisted white colonial rule, but because of the technological superiority of the Europeans, guns, germs, steel, because of the technological superiority of the Europeans, only Ethiopia was able to maintain independence. In 1914, once again, only Ethiopia and Liberia. Liberia were independent of European rule. In Algeria, the native Algerians fought a 50-year war of resistance against the French. Samora Touré was a leader of the Algerian resistance against the French. What unique tactic did the natives of German East Africa employ against colonial rule? Well, one of the leaders of the East African resistance against the Germans told the Africans that they would receive Mai Mai, which was a spell that would make them impenetrable to German bullets. Didn't work. Menelik II was also another leader of African tribes. I'm sorry, of Ethiopian tribes, and he gained Ethiopian independence by playing one European power off against another. And uh, they were lucky in the fact that Menelik II, the only European power he had to contend with were the Italians, who were kind of the laughing stock of the European powerful countries. So Menelik then continued to stockpile rifles and modern weapons in case of another invasion by a foreign power. That will come in 1937, I believe, when our good friend Mussolini wants to expand the Italian Empire and um, he conquered Ethiopia. What were the results of European control over Africans? Of course, the European control over Africans had many, many negative results. Do you have to remember all these? No, but you got to get your head around them. Africans lost control of their own lives and independence. Many Africans died of European disease, like the dreaded smallpox again. Many died from European superiority in weapons. Guns versus spears, not a good equation. Famines resulted from the change to European cash crops. Africa is still reeling. I mean, the Sahara Desert, for example, still is expanding southward, encroaching further and further to the south into the tropical regions of Africa. And that is largely due to the Europeans, well, no longer European, but the Europeans began sucking out the groundwater to irrigate crops with. And also, they changed the type of crops that they grew in Africa. And this really, these cash crops like cotton, like the palm trees, and those kind of things, really did do a number on the soil in Africa. African cultures are being modified and obliterated by newer cultures to which many African natives had great problems dealing with. By the same token, what happened to the Native American tribes who survived the slaughter of the whites? Answer, well, they're not tribes anymore. That's just it. They lost their tribal identity. And, if you look at, and I've said this before in this class, in the United States, if you find all the most undesirable traits that an ethnicity can have, unemployment, drug and alcohol abuse, rates of suicide, rates of illiteracy, Native Americans lead in all those categories. Same thing can be said for these Africans who survived after the Europeans came. The Europeans divided Africa, and here's the big thing. When the Europeans divided Africa in 1885, the so called Scramble for Africa, the Europeans just sat down in Berlin, Congress of Berlin. They sat down with a big map of Africa and they just began drawing straight lines. And they said, you get this, we get that. And it says, some African tribes were split up by Europeans. Other rival tribes were governed over and united under the same government. And the problem was, by splitting these tribes, they created artificial majorities of one tribe in one country, and artificial minorities of another tribe in the same country. And of course, that caused friction between them. And just like you've ever seen Hotel Rwanda or heard of Hotel Rwanda, it was about the great Rwandan genocide of the 1980s, when the Hutus and the Tutsis, tried to kill each other, and like 3 million Tutsis were murdered. What were the positive effects? You like that effects? Colonialism reduced tribal warfare. The Europeans were able to force peace between the former enemies, even if that peace were being forced and not very long lasting. Europeans also brought modern disease fighting techniques to Africa. Believe it or not, African lifespans did increase. Literacy rates did improve. African products began to be demanded around the world, and their economies became more modernized. New things like railroads throughout Africa, dams, bridges, telephones, telegraphs began to crisscross Africa. However, for the most part, these benefits only helped the European interest, not so much the average African person. Yes, John Bull. Who is John Bull? We'll get to that later. But basically, John Bull is the symbol of Great Britain. All right, and so we're going to pick up with the Arab and Ottoman empires tomorrow, or rather Thursday, shall we? All right. And as you see, my homework for tonight is finished. Have a good evening, and we'll talk later, shall we?